This is again a guest who's joining us online. Shary Reeves will be with us in a moment. I think that quite a few of you will be familiar with the name. Ms. Reeves, among other things, worked as a TV moderator, and if you've got children, you will probably know the German TV show Wissen macht A, which was on the Western German television. Together with Ralf Kaspers, she was the moderator for 16 years, and in the year 2016, she got a very special honor, a medal from the federal government for that. But she's also a producer, an author, an actress, and she also had early musical success with her siblings. The four Reeves were successful in soul and hip-hop, and I would also like to add that Ms. Reeves, in her youth, although she's still very young, as you will be able to see in a moment, she played soccer in the first football league, and she was also a candidate for the German national team under the age of 16. But today we're talking about fears and confidence. I'm looking forward to the presentation by Shary Reeves.
Also erstmal möchte ich.
So first of all, let me thank you very much for being able to be with you this afternoon, telling you something about my fears, the fears that I used to have when I was younger and that I still have. At present, the thing is that artists in particular suffer a lot from the corona pandemic because we are often fall short of jobs, and this time around this year, also personally, I lost 50% of my revenue myself. So I'm trying to position myself differently, to do other things, which is not always an easy thing to do because you enter into a new realm, a new job field where others have been settled for years. But what else would you do? I mean, you have to display flexibility to pay your rent, and this is, of course, for me at least, a way of feeling a fear which draws close to existential fear. I mean, it's not that extreme as yet, to be honest, but every now and again I thought about how things would actually go on and what would change for us artists. And it also affects, for instance, the restoration and hospitality business a lot, and it's a difficult situation, but I do hope that we will find an acceptable solution for everyone, because there's no use nobody making money anymore, because who's supposed to finance all of this at some point? My first idea goes back to an African saying, which goes as follows: turn your face towards the sun, because then the shade will fall behind you. What does this have to do with fear? Well, I would like to provide an answer later on. For the time being, I would like to tell you the following about fear. Fear is something which is innate. We have it in our genes, more or less, in every person. And then it also depends on the environment you grow up in and the courage you receive from your surroundings, your friends, your family, the things that work out very well for you and the things that turn out not well for you. Why is that? It's because you actually memorize it for next time, and from your experience you can then again protect yourself from this happening again, and your self-doubt casting its shadow on your life and accompanying you every day, and the self-confidence being nourished from the same source as the doubt that we would want to push back into nowhere. And it all boils down to a basis of fear. Fears that we define similarly, unless all, or despite of all the differences we have, and they make us feel uneasy. And you have to differentiate between an anxiety disorder that can have physical repercussions, for instance, in you sweating, having a tremor and transpiration, and the everyday situative fears. It can be being afraid of an exam or a competition, what have you. And then in that case, we're talking about what we call the fight or flight reactions. According to Wikipedia, they refer to the swift physical and mental adaptation of creatures in situations of danger as a stress reaction. The underlying neurobiological aspects were also looked into in research when animals were put under threat. But what would happen to us? What is actually happening to us in such a situation? Either we react or we would just evade and go away. And For animals, there is even a third option. Well, they are lucky because animals might pretend to be dead. I mean, for us, obviously, this is not an option, but in nature, out there, this, at the end of the day, helps to save lives. Our brain liberates a great deal of adrenaline, and at the same time, we are tensing our muscles and starting to breathe more heavily and more rapidly, so we feel afraid. We feel that fear until we feel safe again. So one thing is clear, depending on the circumstances, fear is an everyday accompaniment. It's a natural reaction to unpleasant situative events that we cannot actually gauge. But whenever fear becomes something that would accompany us permanently, we can talk about an anxiety disorder. So do I feel afraid just while sitting here and giving this presentation? Well, yes and no. Let's define fear, Shary, when referring to my present feeling. Well, but to do so, I'd have to make a little excursion, because at any rate, in my job, I had to deal with fears a lot. And it goes back to my childhood very often, but I'm going to tell you a little story about that one later. The biggest fear that most of my colleagues suffer from is red light, or being put on the spot in front of the camera, because we fear nothing more than that. We have a lot of respect towards it when working in such a job, but spotlight is just part of that anxiety hurdle, and it's also a great deal of distraction whilst you're trying to remember your content. But once the show is on, it recedes, it goes away with the first moment of that live situation. And what is intriguing about it is that the trigger of your fear is not actually the spotlight, but it is the consequence of what is happening once the light is on. The fact that you are not able to realize, to recognize who's behind that camera, which in my case, by the way, is not true right now, because I'm all by myself in this room. This is what makes us feel afraid. I mean, here are the people observing me, watching me. What do they feel? What do they think? What do they wish, and what do they like or dislike about me? It's all those things and more that triggers stress reaction. And what is more aggravating is that in the face of all these uncertainties, you don't even see people's faces, and this is quite nasty. So you can only have a vague idea about the situation you're in. Things become different when being exposed to an audience and to a camera directly at the same time. So, of course, you've got the opportunity here to look your audience in the eyes, but, I mean, the question is whether you actually want to do so. I mean, the mere thought of having people sitting there looking at you grimly, frowning, well, for whatever reasons they might do so, I mean, this inspires us with a feeling of uneasiness, and it actually gives rise to stress, which then in turn leads to a domino effect and might create a situation where you can be completely disconcerted and you start just stumbling or stuttering and not being able anymore to keep your red thread. So what I got used to was to just jump across those first lines. Why did I do so? It helps me feeling less afraid, because the thing is that in this position we're in, we have to actually deal with and grapple with self-doubt as hosts of shows and moderators. And up front, in the run-up to a show, you're often so tense that you expose yourself to the feeling for such a long time before taking the opportunity of not admitting those doubts to set in. And to give you a specific example to let you know how this affects me as well, and whether I've got the same fear when I moderate in front of millions of TV spectators, something which happened quite a lot in the past couple of years. Yes and no is the answer. Because we know that stress does not only trigger fears, but at the same time it makes us stronger. The stress hormone is something like the adversary of adrenaline. It's oxytocin. So in other words, I would look out into the audience, observing and watching the mass of people sitting there, trying to just focus on the friendly faces, which make me feel courageous again. They would inspire me, encourage me, and this familiar feeling would then help me to combat adrenaline, saying, yes, I would trust those other people myself, and thus being better able to concentrate and focus on the things that might help me and guarantee to me that I will pull this through without any friction. But whenever I'm in the midst of my family and relatives, and I would have to maybe pray in front of my family members in church, for instance, this is not such an easy thing and such a pleasant thing to do. Why is that? I would say, and at least I feel like this about it, is that all the eyes that are on me would then judge me. Well, this is at least how I feel, and they wait for me to at last make this one mistake, and this creates a situation where I feel a hole in my stomach and I become nervous. I don't know how you feel about it. Then I try to make a friendly face or find a friendly face in the audience, just like I do it normally, a friendly face, actually feeling that I deserve that victory. I mean, there are not too many, and this person would be then my support, just helping me to balance off my heart rate. This is one situation that has accompanied me for all my life, and there's so many more situations. So when there are things that I don't know that they exist, some things that haunt me at night and deprive me from getting to sleep, how can I define them as a fear attributed for me? And I can only relate to you about my own personal experience, and maybe you can associate with my examples here. Whenever I'm under pressure and I know that something will be coming up that might change my life, and it's maybe something not very pleasant, an unpleasant interview you have to have, or taxes you actually currently can't pay, or it might be good friends that don't call back, then what it does to me is that my eyes start twitching and I start sweating a lot as well. So for me, this is a signal that demonstrates that there is a huge and unsolvable task ahead of me. Unsolvable in as much as I don't really know how to deal with it, how to cope with it without, just in the case of an unpleasant talk, being emotionally sidelined. It's different from looking at a friendly face in the audience. This is now a type of fear that for me cannot be wiped away that easily. And depending on the situation, I can either find a solution that is satisfactory for both sides and it would be an easy and fast ending, or I'd be able to take the fear and slow it down before it gets bigger. But if I'm unable to do so, then it might happen and that I then just drag those fears along, that I think I could solve the problem tomorrow, the day after, hoping unconsciously to find the right moment, the right emotional moment, allowing me to be courageous and deliberate enough to face the problem. Why didn't I go about things in such a way at first, you might ask? I mean, of course, there are so many psychological expert opinions out there that might tell you, well, if you do this or that, or if you refrain from doing this or that, and if you have that block, mental block, then it is high time for us sitting down together, having a talk with a shrink. Well, what I can do about it is that often I tend to push things along and drag them along, things that I don't deem to be important, and then I would actually deal with them in the very last minute. But this is the way I am. I cannot recommend this to any of you, and I think it is quite clear as well that it also depends on the individual character traits of the individual person. And the question that crops up time and again is, why are you doing this, Shary? Well, actually do without the stress and just go about things directly. Roll up your sleeves. So what I did is to find a very appropriate excuse for such situations, if it is an excuse, by the way. I don't think it is, because many people that are in those situations with me tend to believe that it's an excuse. When I tell people, well, I'm one of those creative chaos lovers and my brain doesn't seem to work in such a way, in such a structured way, then most people don't understand me. For me, at least, it feels that way. I mean, these straight, structured manner is not something for me. It's not my cup of tea. I believe that anything that happens to you, any uncertainty, has got a lot to do with how you grew up. And of course, your genes and the genes of your ancestors play quite a decisive role. So I think I quite nailed it, because my ancestors come from regions that partly still today are quite opposite to what we usually know in our cultural environment. So I am, according to that, the first generation growing up in Germany in a foster family, in a boarding school, in a Catholic non-managed school, and later on in a residential area, which was not one you wanted to step foot in after a certain hour. And if you were to ask me who was the most courageous person I know, as a person who actually is free from all fears, I'd point a finger right away to my mother, because my mother's got something which, let's say, is something like the opposite of fear, which is resilience. My mother was migrating to Germany in 1963 as the only family member out of 10 siblings, mind you, and she arrived here with a traveling party which was to do some training in Germany. As a religious woman, she took up training to become a nurse and was then hired in Cologne at one of the most renowned hospitals of Europe at the time, the University Hospital Cologne.
Inmitten der gebildeten Ärzte.
And right in the middle of those well-educated doctors who were all wearing their white smocks, my mother. Let's be honest, I would have been afraid even today. And if you think of the times when my mother worked there and how frequently she was discriminated against because of the color of her skin, her origins, her language, and even when she had 4 different kids that she placed in 4 different foster families, I don't think that she did that out of fear. My mother will know what the reasons were for those decisions, and I'm pretty sure that I know those reasons as well, because I myself became part of a very light-hearted and joy-seeking family in the Rhine area. They were from an era when, Germany was in the phase of reconstruction. And, both of my foster parents were of that kind, and I called them also, Granny and Grandpa. And I asked them whether they were not afraid when they accepted me and my brother as foster kids in the 1970s. And she said, Grandpa and myself, we were a bit naive back then. Well, that was quite the statement to make, let me tell you. But isn't it what this is all about? To not even give your fears the necessary space, to just be quicker than that feeling by just, somehow finding a way around it, just as the two of them did. They just did whatever they wanted to do and then waited to see what happened. And of course there were consequences, because the neighbors tried to get youth services, for example, to understand that it would be just unacceptable to give these children to that particular family and that they would have to be removed. But my grandparents could do what I already alluded to, and that is, to use their abilities in this situation to the best possible effect. It was a stressful situation, but they tried to derive strength out of it and made sure that we could stay for the time being. And how did they manage to do that? Well, I actually got to know them as very caring and loving people, and even if my grandma was convinced in her old age, at least she once described it that way to me, she said that she would never have married her husband a second time, but they still always agreed on this particular point. And that is that whenever you feel fear, you lose confidence and trust. And you could even say that, the human instincts are taking a break when you're afraid. let's take a look at the subjective conviction as to what we think is right and what we consider to be true. Then we learn that fear is not just in close proximity to trust, but is also very close to love. These different forms of feelings have one certain thing in common, and that is that they can actually be felt at the same time. And that would be the ideal case, because then this feeling would give you welcome forms of control, and it would be creating spaces that, psychologically speaking, would allow you to monitor your own state of emotion. Fear might be sometimes the younger sister or the older brother, or the other way around, of control. And from my point of view, it unfortunately is, quite frequently the very opposite of control. But let me come back to that later. When I was young, I was not always successful in going through this world in a courageous manner. Although I had a very loving relationship with my granny, it was very special and it really shaped my life. She was always so positive about life, or in spite of the fact that she raised 11 of her own children. And it was infectious, this joy of life, and I got all the love that all the other children also received, but it was not always easy for me to go through life without being aware of how different you are, how different you look, how different you are in terms of your family background. So different that in my school life, I had a circle of friends that was limited to just one girl all through my primary school years. And this is the kind of fear that, no one wants you to participate in their lives. No one wants to play with you because you look different. That is what taught me to be even friendlier to people, to be even more grateful, to show even more consideration, to work even harder in school, harder than it was necessary, although I was not always successful in that respect. But after leaving my grandparents and going to a boarding school, and a school that was part of a Catholic convent, I for the first time realized what it means to feel fear. I was scared witless, and because until then, I was so protected and so guarded that I could not even imagine that you could feel a constant fear. But then I was standing there in this, room with a nun behind her pulpit who always had her fingers raised, and sometimes she had this tiny little sticks that she also used, and she was looking down on us, on the girls. It was a girls' school. And I felt so intimidated that I started wetting my bed. Night after night, year after year. I was so intimidated and afraid of this new situation and the fact that I became a bedwetter, although my grandma had managed to get me to use the potty when I was only 10 months old, And that actually did not impress the nuns, quite on the contrary. Now, how did I get a grip on that situation, apart from the fact that I was lying awake every night trying not to sleep, and that helped me to even think about the situations first. But the traumatic event that really came before that situation was the hasty goodbye that I took with my grandparents straight to a boarding school with nuns who I never knew before and who I didn't really want to get to know with my young 6 years of age. And what expected me was not an emotionally balanced kind of approach that would, somehow embed me in my new environment in an acceptable way. But coming back to my mother and my other siblings, there was my jealous brother awaiting me, who psychologically put me under so much pressure that I sometimes was just walking through our flat like a ghost. I was trying to avoid anyone, and I felt like people should not be able to tell that Shary is in the flat. I always tried to somehow bundle my power internally, because I always knew that when I approached this brother and stood in front of him, the only possibility for me would be to stand in front of him like a brick wall and to use a well-chosen word in order to balance things out. And sometimes I was rather successful in trying to do that, without really meaning it, because my brother was not a man of many words. Whether I today still feel fears, yes, I've got the fear of losing people that are important to me. And the biggest fear I've always had in my life was to one day to bury my grandma. But then things turned out differently. Within a month, I had to bury my brother, my father, and my grandma, and a very good friend on top of that. Now, can you shift your fears? I'd say you can. At least it felt like you could to me. After losing my brother and my father within a time frame of 4 days only, and then losing my grandma and a good friend within the next 2 weeks, fear turned into a feeling of, dispassionateness and indifference. And so I did not try to extract the fear that I felt there, but I rather postponed feeling the fear. But still, I have to again say that the resilience of my mother, the love of my grandma, the spirit of my father, and the psychological fear of my brother have actually taken away many of my everyday fears, when it comes to parachuting or bungee jumping or jumping down the 10-meter board, but that is a different kind of fear. I know that is the fear of height, which is also somehow related to a fear of losing control. But, overcoming fears to me also means to be able to focus on whatever comes afterwards. The moment that you will encounter after the smoke is clearing. And that is connected to the, belief that there might be a time in the future that would be so much more welcoming to you. And it helps you to try and do away with doubts whenever they show their first signs. Deutschland, that is Germany, is, a fear-based country. Well, if I were to say that fears are a social phenomenon that over the last years or decades have doubled and tripled, then I would say yes, definitely. But you have to always also take into account the conditions and the surrounding conditions. And you would have to ask yourself whether the fear had not always been present and is just being triggered more easily. But first of all, fear, I think, is a very normal and a very important emotion. It is not a bad emotion per se, although we might feel that we're suffering when we feel it. But fear protects us against dangers in terms of evolutionary development. Without fear, humanity would not have survived. Whenever a situation is being categorized as a threatening one, our brain activates a very finely tuned emergency program that allows us to fight, flight, or play dead. And depending on what is necessary in the corresponding situation, we are reacting correspondingly. And on top of that, our brain also stores all of these influencing stimuli in our memory. Impressive. And that is being done in order to protect ourselves against a compatible danger in the future. And that is why a person who once touched a hot plate on their stove, for example, will be especially careful with that stove of theirs next time around, or they may even try to avoid it altogether. And some people might know what I'm talking about. But this kind of survival program is really astounding. After categorizing what if only this categorization as to what is threatening and what's not threatening did not misfire so frequently, because we have a tendency to overgeneralize across all areas of our life. Eating in front of people or going to the post office can, in such a generalized way, be perceived as dangerous, even life-threatening situations where our brain shouts at the top of its lungs, "Get away, you are in the biggest of dangers." So the loss of our natural instincts over the course of our evolution will inevitably lead to us no longer being able to rely on our gut feeling. Fears, as we already alluded to, are also part of our primal instincts. Why do we feel fear to begin with, and what is it out there that would trigger those fears? Well, 5 different causes could be decisive here. First of all, our genetic makeup. Secondly, our personality. Thirdly, it's learning experience. Fourth, it's critical events in our life. And fifth, everyday stress. in our everyday lives, we quite frequently no longer intuitively face conflicting situations, or at least not voluntarily. We don't want to accept stress, and quite frequently we try not even to get our body to produce oxytocin in order to benefit from the situation. No, we'd rather produce adrenaline, feel uncertain, and withdraw, sometimes to our very deepest core inside of us, and in many cases for a very long time. We could say that we are afraid of fear because the reasons for fear are being put into the very last rows of parked in the very last rows of our brain, so that we can hardly get it to the first row of our brain again. So fear is something that is almost palpable all over the globe. It is like a virus that is spreading and multiplying, and this level of fear even brings people to stockpile food for bad times, although in a country like Germany it is very unlikely that we would one day just run out of toilet paper, let's be honest. Now, why is it that many people actually act in this way? What is it that pushes them, and what is it that drives them to actually get entangled in this state of constant fear and to remain in that state? I think that we as humans are responsible for the multiplication of our fears ourselves. Just look at social media. Somewhere to be found between fictional worlds and reality. My generation used to flip through catalogs looking at nice-looking people wearing nice clothes. But nowadays we've got six-packs and backsides and people who look more fictitious with even more fictitious backgrounds, and they're all photoshopped, as we say today. What I'm trying to say is that people can actually nowadays fully and conclusively withdraw from reality. Where are these experiences that would warn me against the possible causes for fears? Causes like my fellow pupils who do mobbing against me online, which is one of the most prominent reasons for fears and anxiety disorders among young people. Being beautiful, not looking like the others, doing your own thing, or wanting to be part of the group, and so on and so forth. All of these are characteristics that can actually increase fears or trigger fears, because if all of these things, you have to deal with all of these things, you quite frequently feel excluded. And yes, I would say that I'm convinced that the fears of the people here in Germany have actually increased over time. But I'm also convinced that many of these things are self-made problems. Why do I believe that I can make such a claim? Well, I travel a lot, and in countries where fear is, let's say, the smallest possible problem for people, that's where I travel. And there may be many of these people that actually feel fear, but still comparing those fears to our fear, they still have a more primal form of fear, I think, a natural protective mechanism that helps to protect me against the risks of our everyday lives. And quite frequently we're just using this as a reason or an excuse in order not to face our fear of possible failure. Because the fear that drives us also always has something to do with our ability to control things.
Fear is a feeling which does a lot to us. It takes away our feeling of safety and certainty. This is what life shows us, and it leaves us with a feeling of emptiness, of void. But it is so typical, so every day, just like love, tears, purest feelings, our smile, our laughter, and our enthusiasm, our fear in our societal coexistence is a basic feeling, a threat of our self-confidence and self-image for each and every one of us, but it's also irrational, so it is not really accessible to logical thinking, which again means that it is up to us to control our fears, and in the run-up up front, not being afraid of being afraid at all. In other words, face your fears, focus, if need be, on a moment of change that might protect you, provide you with some sort of security to get rid of your constraints and to go back to another wisdom of Africa. Turn your face towards the sun, then the shade will fall behind you. In that sense, let me thank you very much for listening, and thank you for allowing me to talk to you about my fears. Thank you for listening so attentively. Yours, Shary.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thank you so much, Shary Reeves. Now let's look around whether we can get that live feed to Shary, because as you might have realized, we recorded this beforehand, but we have got some live contact, some live screen looking at the technology. Can you hear me all right, Shary? Yes, that's perfect. Everything's fine. I can hear you brilliantly. Thank you so much for giving your talk, and thank you also for the many personal things you shared with us. Big thanks to you. We've got a couple of people here on the premises, but we've got almost 200 people sitting out there in front of their screens in Germany and in Europe, and some people forward their online questions to me, but there are questions in the room as well. Professor Bandelow was the first one to raise his hand. We've got a microphone for you. All right, that's what I'm here for. Shary, we once had the opportunity to get to know one another in the TV show Hard Aber Fair with Frank Plasberg as a host. It was quite some time ago. Yes, hello. Good to see you. Yes, you gave a very shrewd and emotional talk about fear, and as a fear researcher, I'm truly impressed because I got to know you now from a different point of view, and I got to know about fear from a different point of view than the scientific one. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. It was so important to me. It was very dear to my heart to have this as personal as possible, because we all deal with fear in some way, and I just related about the points in my life where I'm also caught up by my fears and I'm caught up by the past. Thank you so much. So, Shary, you told us about your mother, about the factor of resilience, and this is what we know from groups of society like the boat people. So specific groups and individuals are obviously able to display resilience. What is your impression from what you've experienced yourself and from what you see in everyday life? Can people learn resilience? Is it ever possible to become more resilient? Will you become more resilient the more difficult the situation is you're faced with? Or is it just something that you're born with, and if you don't have it, then bad luck to you? Well, I believe that, scientifically speaking, I can't give you an answer. I'm not a scientific expert, but when I'm asked to give a personal opinion, if I may, then I believe it is something that, on the one hand, has got to do with the way you grew up, but there has to be a certain breeding ground for it, a certain prerequisite. And I always give the following explanation. My mum is from the tribe of the Chagas, and my father of the tribe of the Kisis. He's from Kenya. My mother is from Tanzania, was born on the foot of the Kilimanjaro. And the Chagas, as a tribe, are a former Bantu tribe from Cameroon. And we know that those are the ones walking upright, the strong guys, the business people that are very much socially committed. And this is what my mother represents as well, on the one hand. And I have siblings, brothers and sisters, and when I look at my two brothers, for instance, or my sister, then I would rather say that in my family, and I'm not the only one looking at things in that way, that I'm the one having inherited my mother's resilience a lot. And then it is all down to how you are raised, are you protected, are you autonomous early on? And this makes you realize that there's a lot of strength in your own person that can help you out later on. So these are the influencing factors, but this is just my own personal opinion I can convey to you. Okay, thank you so much. So I'm trying to build bridges now and come full circle, because today we're talking about the predicament between fear and confidence, and this is also now against the backdrop of the current corona epidemic, and looking at your motto, your mission statement that you showed to us in the beginning and the end, turn your face towards the sun and then the shade will fall behind you. What would be your recommendation? What would be your tip for the future? I mean, there's not a lot of sun at the moment around us when looking at the COVID-19 crisis, but how can we still remain positive, optimistic? How can we follow your mission statement looking into the future? Because for the time being, things seem to be difficult right now. Well, I think it all depends on the way you perceive things. I mean, whether there's a lot of sun around us or not, this is up to you, for you to judge. But for me personally, there's always light at the end of the tunnel, or there's always a glimpse of hope, a little bit of sun. Because what's important in here is not to just focus on one thing too much, but to look at the bigger picture. So as for me, on the one hand, to be honest, I'm also a fan of Professor Strick, who managed to understand that despite of everything that's happening to us in the pandemic, that mental health is not to be sidelined, that people have to be taken along, not just imposing bans on people, but trying to explain to them more emotionally why those measures impose themselves. This sounds a little bit motherly, but I mean, we're so overwhelmed and sometimes we feel out of breath in this crisis. And this is why it's all the more important to be sensitive about what is going on around us. So focusing on the sun, focusing on the bright side, because it's something good. The sun can warm us up, also makes us laugh and smile, and things falling behind us, shadows, shade is something that should also be left behind. So for my liking, it's always about, do you prefer looking at the sun, or do you prefer looking at what's behind you, the dark side behind you? Thank you so much, Shary. Thanks to Cologne. It worked out brilliantly with the technology as well. Thank you so much for your speech and for answering the questions. And best regards to Cologne. Thank you.